I still remember that night, the amber lamp in the corner casting a dull glow across the living room, reflecting off the bottle of anti-nausea meds on the table. The ache beneath my skin wasn't just from the fourth round of chemo, it was colder than that, quieter, like a warning in my bones that something was shifting around me, out of sight, but not out of reach. My name is Ellen Grant, 58 years old. I spent nearly 30 years as an HR manager at Brightwell Dynamics, a mid-sized tech firm out in Portland. And the man I married, Richard, had always been the steady type, thoughtful, dependable. At least, he was when I needed him to be. Throughout my cancer treatment, he played the part of the supportive husband with ease. But as the treatments wore on, I noticed something in his eyes. Not concern, calculation. A kind of quiet resolve that didn't belong to a man worried about his wife's health, but to someone waiting, planning. That night, after I had dozed off from exhaustion, I woke to the hush of wind slipping through the window pane. But it wasn't the cold that stirred me. It was his voice, muffled, coming from the end of the hallway. A low, cautious whisper. I didn't want to eavesdrop. But what I heard froze me. She still doesn't suspect a thing. Everything's moving right on schedule. I felt something inside me tighten, some ancient, instinctual place that screams when trust turns to danger. I didn't know who he was talking to. I didn't know what schedule he meant. But I knew, deep in my gut, that whatever it was, it involved me. And not in any way a wife should ever be involved. I crept back to bed and slid under the covers just before he returned. He climbed in beside me, pulled the blanket up around my shoulders like always. But I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my body aching from more than just the chemo. And for the first time, I began to wonder. Was the man lying next to me still my husband? Or had he already decided I was something to leave behind? From that moment on, I wasn't just fighting cancer. I was preparing for a different kind of war. One I didn't choose, but one I was damn sure going to survive. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor, but no amount of light could quiet the storm brewing inside me. Richard was still asleep, his breathing slow, one arm draped loosely across the spot where I had once felt safe. I slipped out of bed quietly, padding barefoot into the kitchen, pretending I was just another woman starting just another day. But everything felt different, off, like I was walking through a house that no longer belonged to me. As the kettle hissed and the coffee brewed, I reached for my phone, my hand trembling slightly, not from chemo this time, but from something colder, dread. I had never been one to micromanage our finances. Richard handled most of it, and I never thought twice about it because, after all, trust was the currency of marriage, or so I believed. But that morning, for reasons I couldn't yet articulate, I opened our banking app. What I saw made my blood run cold. Withdrawals. Dozens of them. All small enough to seem harmless on their own. $400 here, $1,200 there. But over the last few months, they added up to tens of thousands. I scrolled past line after line of transactions I couldn't recognize. No notes, no explanations, no context. They weren't for groceries or utilities, and they certainly weren't for any joint decisions we'd made. Behind me, I heard the floorboard creak. I locked the screen just as Richard appeared in the doorway, stretching and yawning like a man without a care in the world. His voice was rough with sleep as he asked what was for breakfast, and I forced a smile, placing the phone face down on the counter. He moved to pour himself a cup of coffee, humming softly, like we were any other couple on any other Sunday. But when I told him, casually, almost playfully, that I had checked the bank account this morning. I caught it. The faintest hitch in his breath and the subtle clench of his jaw before he forced a chuckle and dismissed it all as a few short-term investments. His explanation was too smooth, too practiced, and his eyes, which used to meet mine without hesitation, now flickered just long enough to betray him. That entire day, I watched him closely. He spent hours glued to his phone, slipping away to take calls in the hallway or outside on the deck, always with the screen face down whenever he returned. And when he wasn't on the phone, he was oddly cheerful, asking if I needed anything, suggesting we order dinner from my favorite place, offering foot rubs while we watched the news. It felt like he was trying to lay a foundation, not of love, but of control. As if he could keep me comfortable long enough to slip the rug out from under me. That night, as he stepped into the shower, he left his phone on the couch. Richard never left his phone unattended. Never. The screen lit up a few seconds later with a message from a name I didn't recognize. Elena Maris. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might drown out every rational thought in my head. The preview read, "Make sure she stays in the dark." Almost there. I didn't need to read the rest. I didn't need to unlock the phone. Every fiber in my being already knew. This wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. I replaced the phone exactly as it was and sank back into the cushions, clutching my knees to steady my hands. When he walked back in, towel slung over his shoulder, grinning like nothing had changed, I smiled back. But inside, I was on fire. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay there next to him, eyes wide open, watching the ceiling as my mind retraced every moment I had ignored. The late-night calls, the evasive answers, the sudden interest in my accounts, the suggestion we organize our financials in case of an emergency. It was so clear now. I was the emergency. The next morning, he slid a document across the kitchen table, his smile gentle, his tone light. "Just some tax-related paperwork," he said. But the stack was thick, and his fingers tapped the table in that nervous rhythm I'd come to recognize. I flipped through the pages, pretending to skim casually. But on the last page, the truth hit like a freight train. A property transfer agreement, one that would move everything. My retirement savings, the condo I had bought with an inheritance from my father, even my car, into his name. I looked up at him slowly, my hands steady, even as my blood boiled beneath the surface. "What is this?" He shrugged, still smiling, still wearing that mask of domestic ease. "Just consolidation, for your protection, in case something happens to you." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He knew I was sick, he knew I was vulnerable, and he was betting everything that I was too tired, too scared, too trusting to question him. But I wasn't the same woman who had started chemo 5 months ago. I had learned to live with pain, to swallow fear, and to fight in silence. So I placed the document back on the table without a word, stood slowly, and smiled. "Let me think about it." He didn't expect that. He leaned back in his chair, watching me closely, trying to read what was behind my calm. He thought he was playing chess. He didn't realize I had just moved my queen. Because in that moment, I made a decision. If he was willing to gamble everything on the assumption that I was weak, then I was going to show him just how wrong he was. From the outside, everything looked the same. Richard still kissed me on the forehead each morning before heading out, still brought home my favorite muffins from the corner bakery, and still asked if I needed help with my medications, all with the same tenderness he had mastered over the years. But there was something hollow in his gestures now. like watching an actor deliver lines he no longer believed in, still hitting his marks, still smiling on cue, but void of any truth behind his eyes. And while the world outside our home moved forward, neighbours walking their dogs, children riding bikes through the cul-de-sac, I felt like I was moving backward, unravelling from the inside out, trapped in a space where nothing made sense anymore. I didn't tell anyone what I had discovered. Not yet. Not even my sister Margot, who called every Tuesday without fail to check on my treatment progress. I didn't want to speak the words out loud because I wasn't ready to hear them echoed back with pity or disbelief. And in truth, some small fractured part of me still wanted to be wrong, still wanted to believe there was a better explanation for the late-night whispers, the hidden texts, the desperate attempt to seize control of my assets. But deep down, I already knew. As the days passed, a strange silence began to settle over the house, not the comfortable kind that comes from years of shared companionship, but the brittle, unnatural kind that forms when two people are occupying the same space, but living entirely different lives. Richard no longer asked about my doctor appointments. He no longer sat beside me during infusions or picked up soup from that tiny Vietnamese place I loved after chemo. Instead, he buried himself in phone calls, emails, and private conversations with names I didn't recognize and faces I couldn't trace. One afternoon, I overheard him whispering in the garage, his voice clipped and hushed. When I stepped in, pretending to grab a box of light bulbs, he smiled too quickly and hung up, telling me it was just a contractor about roof repairs. But there hadn't been a leak in over a year. It wasn't just the lies that hurt, it was how practiced they had become. And while the house grew quieter, the loneliness began to scream. My body was still recovering from the last round of treatment, and there were moments, early in the morning usually, when I stood in front of the mirror trying to tame what little hair chemo had left me with, when I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked smaller, faded, as if life had slowly erased her and left behind only an outline. But even worse than the physical toll was the emotional exile. The more I tried to ask questions about the finances, about the messages, about the sudden urgency around emergency planning, the more Richard shifted away, offering platitudes instead of clarity. "Don't stress yourself, Elle," he'd say with that same condescending smile. "You need your strength." As if curiosity was a weakness, as if wanting answers meant I was unstable, as if illness somehow made me unworthy of the truth. Then came the final quiet blow. One evening, as I sat curled on the sofa with a blanket over my legs and a heating pad pressed against my lower back, I heard the chime of a calendar notification ring from Richard's laptop. It was a shared alert, something we had set up years ago for things like bill payments or doctor visits. But this time, the event was titled Meeting WJMRE Dissolution. The location, a local law office. The time, the following Tuesday at 3 p.m. He hadn't told me. He hadn't even hinted. He was meeting with an attorney, likely to prepare for divorce, while still asking me if I needed chamomile or peppermint tea before bed. I sat there for a long time, the glow from the TV flickering across the walls, pretending to watch while my heart thudded like a distant drum in my chest. That meeting wasn't just a betrayal. It was proof that he had already moved on, not emotionally, strategically. He wasn't grieving the end of our marriage. He was preparing to extract himself from it, and he wanted to do so cleanly, quietly, and with everything in his name. That night, I didn't speak. I didn't confront him. I simply lay in bed beside him once again, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rhythm of his breathing, trying to steady my own. But in that silence, something shifted. I realized I had become invisible to him, not because of my age or my illness, but because he had already rewritten me out of his future. I was no longer a partner. I was an obstacle, a loose thread to be snipped, carefully and discreetly, before I noticed the unraveling. He didn't think I would fight back. He thought the illness had softened me, aged me, broken me. But what he didn't realize was that the hardest thing cancer had taught me wasn't how to survive pain or endure fear. It was how to recognize when something was slowly killing you and find the strength to cut it out before it spread. And Richard, whatever version of him still lived in this house, was the thing I needed to remove before it destroyed the rest of me. The morning after I saw the meeting on his calendar, I brewed my coffee the same way I always had. 3 scoops of Colombian dark roast, a splash of oat milk, and 1 drop of honey, but the bitterness lingered no matter what I added. Richard sat across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, humming something under his breath, like he hadn't already set the wheels in motion to walk away and take everything with him. I watched him over the rim of my mug, not with sadness this time, but with precision. He wasn't hiding anymore. He had simply convinced himself I wasn't worth the trouble of hiding from. That morning, he looked up, smiled, and casually asked if I had compiled a list of my financial accounts, just in case, as if sharing the details of my personal savings and assets was a normal, loving gesture between husband and wife. I didn't flinch. I nodded lightly, told him I'd pull something together later, then changed the subject with the ease of someone who'd learned how to hide her fear behind good manners and half smiles. But something had shifted. I was no longer waiting for the next blow to come. I was preparing for it. That same afternoon, while Richard was out running errands, I pulled out the fireproof lockbox my father gave me before he passed. Inside were copies of property titles, insurance policies, and statements from accounts he never knew existed, accounts I hadn't touched in years, but had kept open under my maiden name, just in case the world ever turned against me. I never thought I'd need them. But that was before cancer taught me that security isn't something you're given. It's something you build when no one else is watching. I spent the next 3 days moving carefully, strategically, silently. I scheduled meetings during times I knew Richard would be at work, or conveniently held up at the gym with his new trainer, who I now suspected was either working him toward a fitness goal or feeding him confidential legal strategies. Either way, I wasn't about to sit around and wait for his next move. I met with a lawyer first. Her name was Patricia Monroe, a former litigator turned private family law specialist who had a reputation for cutting through legal games like a scalpel through silk. She didn't ask me if I was sure. She didn't treat me like a fragile woman with thinning hair and a heart full of hope. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Tell me everything you know, and I'll help you protect what's yours." And I did. By the end of that meeting, Patricia had helped me draft a plan to restructure my assets, legally, cleanly, and completely separate from any account Richard had access to. We transferred ownership of the condo into a private trust I controlled, rerouted retirement funds through accounts he didn't know existed, and locked down anything that still had my name on it. Every move was documented, time-stamped, and filed through legal channels, long before Richard would ever serve me with the divorce papers he had been drafting behind my back. That same week, I visited the bank where we kept our joint account. I spoke with the branch manager privately, explaining the situation not as a scorned wife, but as a client preparing for a separation she didn't initiate, but refused to lose too. I removed my name from any automatic transfers, froze access to the secondary savings account until further legal review, and redirected all income from my part-time consulting work into an entirely separate account that bore only my signature. Each action was small, methodical, and invisible to someone not paying attention, which, ironically, was exactly how Richard saw me. He still came home each night with that same tired smile, asking how I was feeling, telling me I looked a little stronger today, as though pretending to care would make up for the betrayal he was already halfway through executing. But I just nodded, thanked him, and offered to heat up dinner, because while he thought he was playing me like a pawn, I had already stepped off the board and begun designing a new one where I held every single piece. And then, a moment I hadn't planned for arrived, sharper than expected. It was a Thursday evening. He handed me a stack of papers and said he needed my signature, just to clean things up for tax season. His voice was light, unconcerned, as though I'd just be doing him a favor. But I had learned by now that favors are weapons in disguise when they come from someone who's plotting your exit. I took the papers with a steady hand and flipped through them slowly. On the third page, buried beneath legal phrasing and irrelevant jargon, was a clause that would transfer ownership of everything, from our car to my investments, into his name under the guise of streamlined estate planning. I looked up at him, calm and unreadable. "I'll need time to review these," I said plainly. His smile thinned. "It's all pretty standard, Elle. Nothing tricky." "Even more reason to take a closer look," I replied. He said nothing, but the silence between us thickened like wet concrete. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't pace or rant or pray that this was some mistake. Instead, I sat at my desk and emailed Patricia a scan of the documents with the subject line, "He's making his move. So am I." It was a grey Monday morning, the kind that presses against your skin like a cold breath, and I had just finished folding the laundry when I heard the knock. Not the hesitant kind neighbours give, nor the friendly rhythm of a mailman's hand, but sharp, precise, and unmistakably official. I opened the door to find a man in a navy jacket, expression flat, holding out a large envelope. "Ellen Grant?" he asked. I nodded. "You've been served." I stood in the doorway, envelope in hand, the chill of the hallway creeping through my socks as I watched him disappear down the walkway without a backward glance. I didn't have to open it to know what it was. My gut had been expecting this day for weeks, but when I finally sat at the kitchen table and slid my nail beneath the flap, the truth still stung. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Inside were not just the formal words of goodbye, but demands. Cold, calculated demands. Half the condo, half the remaining joint assets, spousal support, and access to everything he hadn't already tried to take by stealth. He wasn't just leaving. He was trying to walk away wealthy from a marriage he'd hollowed out and discarded, all while I was still nursing the wounds of chemo and holding the emotional remnants of what we had built. I let out a dry laugh, though it felt more like air being forced from cracked lungs. Of course he thought he could do this. Of course he thought I would crumble under paperwork the way I once crumbled under the weight of a diagnosis. But the woman he was divorcing wasn't the woman he had married, and certainly not the one who had stood in front of a mirror every morning, staring at her own hairless reflection, determined to keep breathing. 2 days later, I sat in Patricia's office, the windows behind her casting a pale light over the stack of documents between us. She flipped through the petition with the kind of surgical focus that comes from decades of untangling deceit. Her smirk, faint but unmistakable when she reached the financial breakdown. "Well," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against the paper, "it appears Mr. Grant has underestimated you in more ways than one." I raised an eyebrow. She glanced up and smiled. "You moved your assets into a trust before he filed. Legally, he has no access. And as for spousal support, considering his income history compared to yours, It's going to be a hard sell. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without a weight on my chest. I had expected to fight for scraps, to bargain for mercy from a man who had none left to give. Instead, I had positioned myself with quiet precision, and now it was his plan that was unraveling. Richard, of course, didn't know any of this when he showed up at the courthouse, dressed a little too neatly, tie knotted just a touch too tight, sitting beside his lawyer with the smug composure of someone who thought the game was already won. I sat across from him, calm and measured, hands folded in my lap, not out of submission, but readiness. His lawyer stood first, reading from a carefully prepared script, requesting a full forensic audit of all financial transfers I had made in the past 6 months, claiming I had acted in bad faith, moved money to evade a fair settlement, and intentionally misled him about our shared finances. I didn't blink. Patricia rose, adjusted her glasses, and walked slowly to the center of the room before speaking, not with outrage, but with quiet confidence. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and composed, "all of my client's financial adjustments were made prior to Mr. Grant's petition, and we have documentation to prove it. There is no evidence of fraud, no evidence of concealment, and no justification for an audit." She placed a binder on the judge's bench, a thick one, tabbed and color-coded, containing bank statements, trust documents, and a timeline that painted a clear picture. Everything I had done was legal, traceable, and undeniably mine. "And," she added, her tone sharpening just slightly, "we request this motion be dismissed with prejudice, and that Mr. Grant be held responsible for all legal fees related to this baseless request." The judge took their time, flipping through the binder, face unreadable. The silence stretched thin across the courtroom as Richard fidgeted, his confidence visibly beginning to fray. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched him. This man who had plotted so carefully, only to find himself in a room where his opponent had already played the move he never saw coming. Finally, the judge looked up. "Motion denied," they said, voice firm. "And given the lack of substantive evidence, Mr. Grant will bear the full cost of legal fees incurred by the respondent." The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder in a storm that had suddenly broken in my favor. Outside the courthouse, Richard brushed past me, jaw tight, not saying a word, until he was just close enough to hiss, "You think this is over?" "Just wait." But I didn't flinch. I didn't respond. Because for the first time since all this began, I knew the truth. Not just about him, but about me. He had tried to erase me while I was still healing, had banked on my silence, my sickness, my age, and my fear. But what he didn't realize was that survival doesn't make you soft. It sharpens you. And I had only just begun, just when I thought the worst had passed, when the courtroom doors had closed behind me, and I began to imagine a life without Richard's shadow creeping over every corner. Another call came. It was Patricia, her voice calm but edged with urgency, the kind that tightens your spine before your brain even has time to translate the words. "We have a problem," she said, and I knew before she spoke the next sentence that Richard wasn't done. He had filed a formal complaint, this time in conjunction with a woman named Elena Maris, the same name that had lit up his phone weeks ago like a warning flare I hadn't yet understood. Together, they accused me of falsifying financial records, of laundering funds through the trust I had quietly built, and of misrepresenting my holdings to the court. The implications were devastating, not just the threat of losing assets, but of facing criminal charges, of watching everything I had protected turn to ash under the weight of forged accusations. I remember sitting in my kitchen, the envelope heavy in my lap, its edges trembling under my fingertips as I turned each page. It wasn't just a desperate move. It was a final strike from a man who had realized the war he started was one he could no longer control. But desperation, I've learned, makes people careless. They overlook details. They forge documents with timestamps that contradict existing records. And they forget that a woman pushed to the edge by betrayal and illness doesn't flinch anymore. She sharpens. Patricia and I met that same evening. Beatrice, a forensic accountant Patricia had on standby, had already reviewed the documents submitted by Richard and Eleanor. She found the flaws within minutes. The accounts Richard referenced in his fabricated records hadn't even existed when the supposed transactions occurred. The evidence, while cleverly doctored, collapsed under scrutiny. Too many inconsistencies, too many lies layered over technical realities they never understood. That was all the permission I needed. For months, I had played defense, quietly protecting what was mine, countering his advances without ever fully pressing forward. But now, with forged evidence in my hands and a team of professionals behind me, I no longer had to defend. I could attack, and I would. Patricia helped me file a counterclaim, not just a motion to dismiss their complaint, but a civil suit against both Richard and Elena for defamation, fraudulent misrepresentation, and the submission of falsified legal documents. The case built itself. For every lie they told, we had a document, a timestamp, or a testimony to tear it down. The financial analyst's report was damning, methodical, and brutally clear. Every forged transaction, every manipulated statement, it was all there, outlined in red, impossible to refute. 2 weeks later, we stood in court once again. Richard looked smaller this time, thinner perhaps. Or maybe it was the absence of arrogance that made him seem diminished. Elena sat beside him, pale and rigid, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. Their lawyer tried to delay the proceedings, claiming the evidence was inconclusive, but the judge wasn't swayed. Patricia, calm and relentless, laid out our case with surgical precision. Point by point, she dismantled every claim they had made, exposing not only their lies, but their motives. The final blow came when the forensic expert took the stand. She explained in plain, undeniable terms how the forged documents had been created, how metadata proved their fabrication, and how, ironically, Richard's own digital trail led straight back to him. When Patricia submitted our damages claim and requested full recovery of legal fees, as well as punitive compensation, the judge didn't hesitate. The ruling was swift, clear, and absolute. The complaint was dismissed with prejudice. All legal costs were to be paid by Richard and Eleanor jointly, and our defamation suit would proceed with the court's full support. I didn't smile when the gavel fell. I didn't cheer. I simply sat still, feeling a kind of silence I hadn't known in months. Not the silence of fear or betrayal, but of finality. The storm had broken. And though the air was still heavy with the remnants of what I had endured, there was peace in knowing that justice, real, tangible justice, had finally arrived. Outside the courtroom, Richard walked past me without a word. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes said enough. He knew it was over. He knew I had won. But more than that, he knew I had done it without ever raising my voice, without stooping to his level, and without letting bitterness consume me. I had faced him not as the woman he tried to control, but as the woman he never truly saw coming. 2 days after the judgment was finalized, I found myself sitting in Patricia's office one last time, the late afternoon light casting soft amber tones across the wood grain of her desk. She slid the final settlement across the table without flourish, her voice gentle but steady as she said, "It's done." He signed. I stared at the papers for a moment, not because I didn't believe her, but because there was something surreal about seeing closure written in ink. For months, my life had been ruled by waiting for tests, waiting for treatments, waiting for Richard's next move. But now, for the first time, there was nothing left to wait for. No hearings, no threats, no silent glances across courtroom benches. I picked up the document and read it carefully, even though I already knew what it said. Richard would walk away with nothing, not the condo, not a dime from my accounts, not a cent of support. His financial claims had backfired. His reputation was in pieces, and whatever power he once held over me had evaporated the moment the judge delivered the verdict. I hadn't just survived his betrayal. I had undone it, thread by thread, until nothing he tried to build against me could stand. Patricia watched me with a soft smile, her voice cutting through the stillness like a quiet note of triumph. "How do you feel?" I exhaled slowly, not a sigh of exhaustion, but of release. "Lighter," I said, and I meant it. The weight I had carried for months, for years really, had finally begun to lift. That evening, my sister Margot hosted what she called a victory dinner, though to me it felt less like a celebration and more like a return to something lost. There were candles on the table, a roast in the oven, and laughter that didn't feel forced. When I stepped into her home, she pulled me into a long, wordless hug, the kind that says everything without needing to explain a thing. Over glasses of champagne and slices of warm apple pie, we talked not about lawyers or courtrooms, but about books, old family vacations, and what kind of flowers I wanted to plant in the spring. Later that night, I stood on my balcony overlooking the Portland skyline, the city stretching out before me like a map I could finally read again. For the first time in so long, I didn't feel like I was looking over my shoulder. I wasn't scanning for traps or flinching at shadows. The silence was no longer a warning. It was a promise, one I had earned. In many ways, I had lost more than a marriage. I had lost illusions about love, about safety, about permanence. I had lost time, energy, and a part of myself that once believed that loyalty alone could hold something broken together. But what I gained was far greater. I gained clarity. I gained strength. And above all, I reclaimed the quiet, steady voice inside me that had never truly disappeared, only been drowned out by doubt and fear. I now know that betrayal doesn't define you, but how you respond to it does. When someone takes advantage of your vulnerability, whether because of illness, age, or circumstance, it's easy to believe you're disposable. It's easy to think your best years are behind you, and that dignity is something you forfeit the moment you're seen as weak. But that's not the truth. The truth is, value doesn't fade with time, and strength doesn't always look like loud resistance. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like silence. And sometimes it looks like showing up to court with a binder full of receipts and a lawyer who believes in your story. I share this now not because I want sympathy, but because I know I'm not alone. I know that out there are women and men who've given their best years to relationships, jobs, and families, only to be told, when things get hard, that they're replaceable. You're not. You are never too old, too sick, or too tired to fight for what is rightfully yours. And sometimes, walking away, calmly, completely, and with everything still intact, is the most powerful revenge of all. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to quietly rise while someone tried to erase you? Have you ever surprised someone who thought they had you figured out? If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, or just drop a 1 to let me know you're out there and that you're still standing, just like I am. And if you want to hear more true stories of resilience, betrayal, and the quiet power of fighting back, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's more to come. Until next time, stay strong, stay wise, and never, ever let someone else decide your worth.